Okay, so I really want you to take a second and completely deconstruct your working definition of mathematics.
Which is, no small task. I mean, we rely on that definition literally every day.
Right, exactly. Like completely strip away the utilitarian layer. Because we generally operate under this assumption that math is just, well, a descriptive language, an inventory system, basically.
Yeah, we assume physical reality is the fundamental substrate, right? And mathematics is merely the symbolic logic we develop to map it out,
Yeah,
to measure it and manipulate it.
exactly. But the framework we are exploring today on this deep dive flips that entire ontological hierarchy totally on its head.
It really does. It asks the question, what if the algebraic tools aren't descriptions of spatial phenomena, but the actual generative mechanisms of the phenomena
Which
themselves?
is just a wild premise.
Mm.
Like, what if the universe isn't a physical system that we describe with math, but a mathematical system that outputs physics as a byproduct?
It's a massive inversion of classical mechanics. I mean, we're diving into a model where a mathematical operator isn't just something you write on a chalkboard to solve a physics problem.
Right, it's not just a symbol.
Exactly. The operator is the physics. It
Right.
is the literal spatial action that generates mass, dimension, and even biological structure.
And this is the core thesis of this really fascinating 2026 manuscript by George James Dukas. It's called Providence, From Quaternary Origin to Harmonic Integration.
It is an incredibly ambitious text.
Oh, totally. Our mission on the deep dive today is to really trace the architecture of this manuscript. And the scope is just staggering. We are navigating a trajectory that starts in an absolute pre-dimensional void.
Right, literally before anything exists.
Yeah, and then constructs a geometry of consciousness, mathematically derives the physical constants, and eventually maps all those abstract operators right onto the actual physical architecture of the Great Pyramid.
And human DNA. Don't forget that part.
Oh man, yeah. The nucleotide sequences of human DNA. It's wild. So, the manuscript sits at this incredibly dense intersection of abstract algebra, quantum structuralism, and what we might call mathematical theology.
Yeah, and it demands that we completely abandon our spatial biases. Like, to understand Dukas, you really have to stop thinking of numbers as quantities of things.
Right, not like counting apples in a basket.
Exactly. You have to start recognizing them as behavioral orientations within a structural lattice.
Which is tough. I mean, the first major hurdle I had in reading this text was just grasping the starting line. Because Dukas doesn't start with the Big Bang or, quantum fluctuations.
No, he goes back much further than that.
Right. He starts with something he terms the distinguishing mind, and he sets this against a backdrop called oblivion.
Which is a very specific term in his framework.
Yeah. And my initial read of oblivion was just to equate it with like a vacuum state or a void. But the text goes way out of its way to reject that comparison.
Because a vacuum is still a spatial concept. I mean, a vacuum implies a geometric arena that just happens to be empty of matter.
Right. It's a room with no furniture in it.
Exactly. But the room itself still possesses dimensions, and dimensionality requires mathematical operators, specifically spatial gates, to sustain it. Dukas defines oblivion strictly as the non-operator state.
So it's an absolute lack of distinction. Like there is no geometry, no continuity, no discontinuity. It exists entirely outside of what he calls the operator lattice. You can't even assign the number 0 to it.
No, because 0 is highly structural.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
We usually think of 0 as just nothing.
In standard math, sure, but structurally, 0 represents a specific boundary of collapse. Oblivion lacks the capacity for boundary. It is an unbroken, undifferentiated continuum.
Wow.
Yeah, to even call it nothingness is kind of a linguistic failure, because nothingness implies the absence of something. In oblivion, the concept of something hasn't even been algebraically permitted yet.
Okay, which introduces this threshold state he talks about called awareness. Dukas positions awareness as the pre-operator state.
Right.
So if oblivion is the absolute lack of distinction, awareness is the latent capacity to make a distinction. It's poised right on the boundary, and he calls this boundary the veil.
The veil is essentially the absolute origin point of mathematical generation. And the mechanism of crossing that veil is what Dukas defines as the very first algebraic act.
And this is where it gets crazy, because he insists it is not a physical fluctuation. It's a cognitive partition.
Yes. It is the act of a structural mind recognizing itself by drawing a boundary in the continuum.
Okay, I want to pause on this idea of the structural mind making a cognitive partition, because it reminds me of, think of it like a completely blank canvas.
Right, yeah.
Oblivion is just the empty canvas. Awareness is the painter holding the brush, ready to strike. The exact moment the brush hits the canvas, making that first dividing line that is the birth of the system.
That's a great analogy. That stroke shatters the continuum into what he calls the quaternary alphabet. 1, most 1, 0, and Miscelero.
Right, but I have a huge pushback here. In classical physics, we look for a prime mover in the form of a singularity or a quantum field. Dukas is arguing that the prime mover is an act of logic.
Yes, the abstract establishment of this versus that.
But wait, so Dukas is saying physics and geometry didn't create math, but that thought created math. How do we even define thought here if biological brains don't exist yet? I mean, it flirts dangerously with anthropocentrism, projecting human psychology onto abstract algebra.
Yeah, the text definitely anticipates that friction. When Dukas specifies a distinguishing mind, he is attempting to divorce the concept of cognition entirely from biological neurology.
Okay, so what does he mean by mind then?
He defines mind strictly as the mathematical capacity to execute a non-random partition. Think about it in an undifferentiated continuum. A random fluctuation cannot yield perfect quaternary symmetry.
Because randomness is messy.
Exactly. The establishment of 1, Nicas 1, 0, and Nicolos requires an intentional structural selection. So the mind in this context is simply the requisite structural agency that selects order over oblivion.
Oh, I see. So he is defining cognition mathematically rather than biologically. Cognition is just the mechanism of intentional symmetry breaking.
Precisely. The algebra does not self-generate. To partition an infinite continuum into finite directional states requires a distinguishing mechanism, and that mechanism is what he calls mind.
Okay, if we accept this initial cognitive split, we are left with these four basic conceptual brushstrokes, right? The 1, Negus 1, 0, and Negus 0.
The foundational building blocks of his entire universe.
But it's crucial for everyone listening to recognize that this is not a base 4 numerical system.
No, not at all. Base 4 is still a quantitative counting method. The quaternary alphabet consists of orientation states. They do not represent amounts. They represent structural behaviors.
Right, so let's break those behaviors down because they literally inform everything that follows in the manuscript.
Yeah.
He defines 1 and Magus 1 as positive and negative unity. The text frames them as vectors of presence, right? Like forward and reverse orientation of a unified state.
Yes. If you go back to your Candace analogy, the line drawn in the void 1 and Magus 1 are the establishment of the two sides of that line. They are the presence of a distinction.
Okay, and then 0 and Negus 0.
Conversely, 0 and Negus 0 are the states of collapse. They represent positive and negative absence. They are the boundaries where the distinction folds back onto itself.
See, I struggled initially with the necessity of a negative 0. In conventional arithmetic, 0 is just neutral, it's not a sign. But in this operator lattice, negative 0 is functionally totally distinct from positive 0.
Because we're dealing with orientation, not quantity, if 0 represents the collapse of a structural state, positive 0 is the forward orientation of that collapse, and negative 0 is the reverse orientation.
So it's giving a direction to nothingness.
It provides a directional vector to the absence of structure, yes. Without both, the algebraic system cannot achieve the absolute symmetry required to remain stable in the void. The quaternary alphabet has to be perfectly balanced, or the whole thing just collapses back into oblivion.
Okay, so we have these four orientation states, but 1 Nation 1, 0 and any 0 are just static behaviors. They don't inherently build a universe. For reality to manifest, these vectors actually have to interact.
Right, they have to start moving.
And that interaction occurs in what the manuscript calls the proto-layer of operators.
The proto-layer is where the quaternary alphabet essentially weaponizes itself into geometry. The 4 orientation states give rise to the 6 primordial operators,
which are addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, the square, and the square root. But again, Dukas redefines these entirely, doesn't he?
Completely. They are not arithmetic calculations. You have to think of them as spatial geometry gates.
This was the first major conceptual shift for me. He roots addition and subtraction strictly in the 1 and mighty 1 states. So if 1 is positive unity, the presence of structure, then the addition operator is the actual spatial act of inserting a point into a continuum.
Yes, it physically creates a linear interval.
And subtraction is the reverse, the physical removal of a point.
And if you execute those operators sequentially, you build what he calls an additive ladder. You are stacking linear intervals one after another.
Okay, so this is the domain of closed geometric shapes, right? By continuously inserting points, you define perimeters and boundaries.
Exactly. It's very linear.
But then multiplication and division operate on an entirely different physical mechanism. They are born from the 0 and 0 states. So they don't insert or remove points, they subdivide existing intervals.
The multiplicative ladder governs exponential scaling. If you take a spatial interval and divide it and then divide the subdivisions, you are not extending a linear boundary anymore. You are generating a fractal expansion within the space.
Which mathematically is the architecture of wave propagation. I was thinking about it like this. Tell me if this analogy works. Addition is like building a fence, post by post. It's linear. You're adding one unit at a time.
Right.
But division and multiplication are like a single living cell dividing repeatedly. It's exponential. It expands outward like a wave.
That is a brilliant way to picture it. It creates a fascinating dichotomy in the universe. The additive domain born from unity generates our rigid, closed structures. The multiplicative domain, born from 0, generates our propagating waves and exponential fields.
And the text points out that these two domains are mechanically bound together. They attach at unity, and they separate at 0.
Because unity is the structural anchor. It is the sole point where the linear boundary and the propagating wave perfectly coincide. 0 is the separation boundary where the wave collapses and the linear structure terminates.
So basically, everything we perceive as a physical universe is just the endless interplay between the additive ladder building boundaries and the multiplicative ladder generating waves.
That's the core mechanics of it, yeah.
But wait, if we follow that logic, a universe built entirely on those two ladders would just tear itself apart. You'd have endless linear perimeters stretching into infinity and fractal waves subdividing into infinity. There's no containment. How does an endlessly propagating wave ever form a cohesive physical structure?
And that structural crisis is exactly what necessitates the constants we observe in physics. The universe cannot remain an open system of endless propagation. It requires a mechanism of closure.
Which brings us to the deterministic encoding of the pi sequence.
Yes, and Deuce's treatment of pi is probably the most aggressive departure from standard mathematics in the entire manuscript.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, we are all conditioned to view pi simply as the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, producing this transcendental infinitesimal expansion. But the manuscript strips away the ratio definition entirely.
It defines pi as the numerical footprint of an actual geometric event.
Okay, walk me through that event.
When the multiplicative ladder generates that initial primordial wave we were just talking about, it expands outward. But because it is bound by the rules of the quaternary alphabet, it has to expand symmetrically in 4 distinct phases, or quadrants.
Right, but an unchecked four-phase wave just dissipates.
Right.
It needs containment.
And the containment mechanism is the square root operator.
Okay, this blew my mind.
In Deuce's framework, the square root operator is not just a mathematical inversion of squaring. It is a physical force of dimensional contraction. When applied to the expanding wave, the square root operator forcibly contracts the wave back toward the origin point. It imposes absolute structural symmetry.
So the wave pushes outward in 4 phases, and the square root operator simultaneously pulls it inward. And the tension between that quarter expansion and the square root contraction locks the wave into a closed, stable boundary.
Yes, and that locked boundary is the two-dimensional circle.
Which is wild. So pi is the exact numerical signature of that specific interaction.
The infinite decimals of pi are not just some random mathematical artifact. They are the deterministic record of the tension between exponential expansion and root contraction.
Okay, so that solves the containment problem for a flat 2D plane. But physical reality possesses volume. If the square root operator acts as the anchor that pulls a wave into a flat circle, how does the system generate the third dimension?
This requires a dimensional lift. If the square root is the operator of contraction, its counterpart, the square operator, is the operator of dimensional elevation.
Okay.
The manuscript asserts that when the square operator is applied to the fully formed 2D circle, it physically inflates that boundary into a 3D volume. It lifts the circle into a sphere.
And the resulting mathematical signature of that spherical domain is pi squared.
Exactly. Pi squared represents the complete, stabilized, three-dimensional architecture of the universe.
I really want to interrogate this concept of the dimensional lift for a second, because
Sure.
it really challenges our most basic arithmetic assumptions. Like, we are taught that squaring a number is just self-multiplication. 5 squared is 25. It's purely quantitative.
Right.
Are you saying that in this framework, squaring something doesn't just mean multiplying a number by itself, but literally blowing a flat 2D circle up into a 3D beach ball?
That is exactly what it means. It is the mechanism by which the operator lattice scales reality upward. A line squared becomes a plane squared becomes a volume. And Dukas insists this sequence is strictly irreversible.
Meaning what? You can't go backwards.
Right. You cannot simply reverse the math and collapse the sphere back into the wave. The progression from primordial wave to quarter expansion to square root contraction to circle to square lift to sphere is a one-way cascade of geometric creation. Nothing external is added. The sphere is simply the circle raised by the square operator.
He describes the transcendental numbers as the exhaust left behind by this geometric engine. We look at pi, or pi squared, and we just see chaotic strings of decimals. But we are actually just looking at the exhaust fumes of spatial dimensions locking into place.
This is the perfect way to conceptualize it. The numbers do not dictate the geometry. The spatial actions dictate the numbers.
If that is true, then those seemingly chaotic decimal expansions shouldn't be entirely chaotic, right?
Yeah.
If they're the exhaust of a highly structured, perfectly symmetrical geometric engine, there should be some underlying order to them.
And this is exactly where Dukas introduces the concept of decimal grid and harmonic balance.
Which I found to be one of the most compelling yet highly debatable sections of the text.
It definitely raises eyebrows. He shifts from abstract spatial geometry to observable numerical data here. He takes our standard base 10 decimal system, the digits 0 through 9, and strips them entirely of their quantitative value.
Because we tend to view base 10 as just a morphological convenience. We have 10 fingers, so we count in tens.
Exactly. But Dukas redefines the decimal system as the fundamental dimensional addressing grid of reality.
Basically the coordinate system for the operator universe.
Yes. He argues that the digits 0 through 9 are not arbitrary symbols. They are discrete dimensional markers. And to prove this, he analyzes the decimal expansions of the primary operator numbers.
Like phi, which he links to velocity orientation, and psi, which links to time orientation.
And, of course, pi squared, the spherical constant.
Right.
When you map these transcendental constants onto the base 10 grid, Dukas claims you uncover a harmonic digit balance. If you isolate the infinite decimal expansions of these numbers and chop them into discrete 100-digit blocks, an astonishing symmetry emerges.
I'll break that down for me.
Within every single 100-digit sequence, each of the 10 digits from 0 to 9 appears exactly or approximately 10 times.
Wait, so 10 zeros, 10 ones, 10 twos? Distributed evenly across every single block, repeating into infinity.
Yes. It is an assertion of absolute structural coherence. Dukas argues this balance proves that the universe is not a chaotic projection. The operators demand perfect symmetry. And when that symmetrical spatial geometry is translated into our base 10 addressing grid, it manifests as this perfectly even distribution of digits.
I have to throw a massive flag on the play here, though.
I figured you might.
Because any number theorist looking at this is going to immediately cite the concept of normal numbers. A normal number is mathematically defined as a real number whose infinite decimal expansion distributes its digits uniformly. It is a well-documented statistical property. We already know that pi and phi behave like normal numbers, meaning that over a large enough sample size, you will absolutely see an even 10% distribution of the digits 0 through 9.
Right.
So couldn't a mathematician just say that's a statistical quirk of normal numbers? Why does this specific 10 by 10 block distribution prove that the digits are operator states, rather than just math doing its usual chaotic thing?
It is the most vital critique to level at this section of the manuscript. If Dukas were simply pointing out uniform distribution over millions of digits, it would be mathematically unremarkable. But his argument hinges entirely on the timing and the resolution of the stabilization.
Okay, what do you mean by timing?
He is not looking at statistical averages over a million digits. He is looking at rigid structural collapse within hyperspecific 100-digit blocks.
So it's about how quickly the symmetry locks in, rather than the fact that it eventually averages out.
Exactly. And he points to the behavioral differences between the constants to prove it. For foundational operators like phi and psi, the velocity and time markers, he notes that this 10 by 10 harmonic balance stabilizes almost immediately, usually within the first or second 100-digit block.
Why is that?
Because they sit intimately close to the quaternary origin. They are low-level operator spates, so their translation onto the decimal grid requires almost no processing.
Okay. But for pi squared, it takes significantly longer.
For pi squared, the harmonic balance requires roughly 2,000 digits of expansion before the 10 by 10 block structure locks in and maintains stability.
Wow, 2,000 digits.
Yes, and Dukas argues this delay is structural proof of the dimensional lift. Pi squared is not a foundational operator, it is a higher-tier architectural state. It had to be processed through the wave, the root contraction, the circle, and the square lift. That complex cascade of geometric gating delays the harmonic stabilization when projected onto the base 10 grid.
That is a staggering interpretation. He is basically arguing that the statistical properties of normal numbers are actually the observable shadows of structural geometry resolving itself. Like, the mass isn't just generating randomness that eventually averages out, it is actively computing a balanced state. And the time it takes to compute that state depends on how many dimensional gates the operator had to pass through.
The squaring operator knows nothing. The origin knows everything. That is the exact phrase Dukas uses. The mathematical calculations themselves do not generate the harmony. The operations merely unpack and expose the absolute symmetry that was already encoded in the very first cognitive partition, the quaternary alphabet. The harmony is latent from step one.
But this brings us to a massive structural roadblock. If the system is perfectly symmetrical, perfectly balanced, and locked into these stable harmonic blocks, it is entirely static. Dukas calls this complete balanced state providence, right?
Yes, providence.
This is a flawless architectural blueprint. But a flawless blueprint sitting on a table doesn't build a house. A perfectly balanced equation doesn't generate heat or light or matter. It requires an engine of change.
Up to this point, the entire manuscript has described a closed loop of structural revelation. The primordial operators, the dimensional lifts, the harmonic grids, they are all summarized in what he terms the primordial master equation. But as you pointed out, a perfectly balanced master equation is inert. It cannot produce physical reality. To move from a static blueprint to a generative universe, the system requires a catalyst that fundamentally breaks the symmetry of providence.
Which introduces the eternum nexus. Mathematically, how does Dukas even define an operator that sits outside of this primordial loop?
The eternum nexus is the binding agent. The text defines it as the first non-primordial operator. Its sole mathematical function is continuity. It takes all the disparate, isolated stages we just discussed, the orientation states, the linear intervals, the spherical domains, and chains them together into a single, continuous feedback loop.
So it connects the end to the beginning.
Exactly. It ensures that the output of the final spherical domain is immediately routed back into the quaternary origin, keeping the system active.
It provides the continuity, sure, but it still doesn't provide the asymmetry required to create something new. It just keeps the perfect engine spinning.
Which is why the eternum nexus is instantly followed by the creation identity. This is arguably the most important operator in the entire framework.
Okay, why?
Because the creation identity is the first mathematical function that is strictly expansive. By definition, it is an operator that outputs more structural data than it receives as input.
Oh, wow. So it violates the conservation of mathematical symmetry.
It has to. If an operator only outputs exactly what it receives, reality remains trapped in a static loop forever. The creation identity inherits the balanced structure from the eternum nexus and forces it to generate novel protogeometry. It introduces the first non-primordial numbers. It is the catalyst for genuine expansive creation.
And Dukas attempts to make this bulletproof by introducing a uniqueness theorem within his free algebra.
Right, he doesn't just present the eternum nexus as a convenient idea, he attempts to prove it mathematically. He provides a proof demonstrating that the eternum nexus is the only possible length 4 mathematical term that can satisfy all the positional predicates required to bind the primordial system.
Wait, the only one?
The absolute only one. It is not one option out of a probability curve. It is the singular mathematical key, capable of locking the entire quaternary architecture together.
I love that. Think about it like having all the perfectly engineered parts of a car engine just laid out on the floor. Eternum nexus is bolting them together into a single unit. And then the creation identity is finally turning the ignition and actually driving somewhere new.
That's a very grounded way to view it.
So the math itself dictates that the universe could only have been activated in this exact configuration. The eternum nexus binds the engine, and the creation identity provides the expansive friction that turns abstract geometry into observable reality. But how does that expansion actually manifest? Like, how do we get from a pi-squared spherical domain to a physical universe governed by time and space?
To extract time and space from the spherical domain, Dukas initiates a process of subtractive symmetry breaking. We start with the established spherical constant, pi squared. The manuscript introduces a reductive formula, pi squared minus 1.
He subtracts the unity boundary.
Exactly. By subtracting 1 from the sphere, you remove the outer continuous boundary. What is left exposed is the inner structural framework that allowed the dimensional lift to occur in the first place. You expose a structural square. Because this square inherits the original quaternary symmetry of the expanding wave, it divides perfectly into 4 equal quadrants.
And this is where the physical constants are born. He maps these exposed quadrants directly to phi and psia. By stripping away the unity boundary of the sphere, the universe unleashes velocity and time into the structural lattice.
The subtraction of unity is the birth of chronological progression. But Dukas does not stop there. The symmetry breaking cascades. If pi squared minus 1 gives us time and velocity, the text posits a subsequent reduction.
Okay, what's the next reduction?
What happens if you subtract 7 additional units from the domain?
So the formula becomes pi squared minus 1 minus 7, which is effectively pi squared minus 8.
Yes. And numerically, pi squared is roughly 9.8696. So when you subtract 8 from that domain, you are left with a structural remainder of 1.8696. And this subtraction sequence is what Dukas identifies as the eightfold transcendental partition.
And this right here is exactly where the manuscript vaults out of abstract algebra and lands squarely in speculative theology. The transition is jarring, to say the least.
It is easily the most controversial section of the text because he maps mathematical remainders directly onto cosmological and theological concepts. Dukas argues that the 7 units subtracted from the domain correspond precisely to 7 created realities, or structural partitions.
Basically the classical 7 heavens.
Yes. Each of the 7 subtractions represents a distinct symmetry break that generates a unique dimensional tier of reality. But it is that final remainder, the 1.8696, that serves as the capstone. Because that remainder is greater than 1, it represents a structural state that is intrinsically larger than the unity of the operator lattice.
Okay.
Dukas designates this remainder as the 8th tier.
The transcendental tier.
He labels it the throne domain of God. It is the uncomputable, transcendental remainder that sits above the 7 created partitions.
Okay, this requires a massive shift in how we analyze the text. We have spent the last, hour meticulously tracking spatial vectors, dimensional lifts, and operator lattices. Now we are mapping mathematical remainders to the throne of God. I have to ask, as a reader, are we supposed to view this eightfold structure and the Christ operator as literal religious truths? Or is Dukas using religious language as a metaphor for mathematical symmetry breaks?
I will say, impartially reporting on the text itself, the tone of the manuscript leaves very little room for pure metaphor. Dukas posits the mathematics as the literal mechanism of divine architecture. The algebra is the method by which the theological structure manifests. However, he is mathematically precise in how he positions the divine.
How so?
God is not defined as an operator within the lattice. God cannot be an operator because operators require boundaries and interactions to exist.
So God exists in the 8th tier, outside the lattice entirely.
Yes, God is positioned as the first cause that occupies the transcendental remainder. It is from this non-computable tier that the original distinguishing mind was deployed to execute the first cognitive partition in oblivion. The operators simply describe the mechanics of how the creation sequence unfolds, but the absolute origin of the sequence sits in that uncomputable 8th tier.
Man, the theological mathematics get even more specific when he introduces what he calls the Christ operator. He uses the Pythagorean 3-4-5 right triangle to build a theological operator triad.
And he assigns highly specific structural meanings to those integers.
What are they?
The number 3 represents the triune nature of the transcendental unity, and number 4 represents the quadrant geometry established by the initial primordial wave. But the crucial integer is 5, specifically in the form of its square root, the square root of 5.
Right. Why does the square root of 5 function as the mathematical linchpin here?
Because mathematically, the square root of 5 is the fundamental gateway that links pure conceptual unity to measurable physical structure. It is the core component of the golden ratio, phi, which dictates natural biological growth, fractal spiraling, and structural scaling across the entire universe.
So it's everywhere in nature.
Exactly. By situating the Christ operator at the 3-4-5 intersection, Dukas is arguing that it is the exact harmonic nexus where the uncreated transcendental tier, the 3, meets the structural geometry of the universe, the 4, to generate physical creation, the 5.
It is positioned as the mathematical singularity, where the divine intersects with the physical. Now, whether a reader accepts the theological mapping or views it as an eccentric overextension of Pythagorean mysticism, the internal logic of his architecture is astonishingly rigid.
It is incredibly consistent.
He builds a completely unbroken chain from a cognitive choice in a void to geometric boundaries to time to structural heavens to a mathematical bridge for creation.
But a theoretical framework, no matter how internally consistent, requires a physical manifestation to anchor it. If this complex lattice of operators and symmetry breaks actually governs reality, it must leave a physical footprint.
Which brings us to the final, and frankly most explosive, section of the deep dive. Dukas abandons the abstract ether and maps this exact sequence of operators directly onto two physical structures: the Great Pyramid of Giza and the molecular architecture of human DNA.
It is the ultimate application of the Hermetic principle. As above, so below. Let us examine the macro implementation first. Dukas rejects the entirety of standard Egyptology regarding the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, he completely throws it out.
He does not view it as a tomb, a monument, or an astronomical observatory. He asserts that the pyramid is a literal physical implementation of the primordial operator lattice. It is a lithic computer.
A machine made of stone, designed to process these specific mathematical frequencies.
Exactly. And he uses the interior architecture to prove it. He points directly to the king's chamber. The dimensions and internal configurations of that granite room are not arbitrary architectural choices. They are physical renderings of the math we have just been discussing.
Okay, give me an example of the math in the room.
The inner and outer geometric boxes that define the chamber utilize exact 1 to 2 to the square root of 5 spatial ratios.
So the architecture physically models the additive ladder, the 1 and 2, combining with the creation gate, the square root of 5.
And the overall proportions of the room rigidly adhere to the 3-4-5 harmonic triad. The room is a physical echo of the Christ operator geometry. But Dukas goes further into the actual mechanics of the chamber. Suspended above the main room are 5 massive granite stress-relieving slabs. Traditional archaeology views these merely as weight distribution architecture.
But Dukas identifies them as phononic memory drives.
Yes.
Phononic meaning they operate on sound and vibrational frequency rather than electrical current.
Yes. They form a 5-tier harmonic lattice. When the chamber is activated acoustically, these granite drives are designed to store and propagate specific vibrational patterns. The dual box geometry of the room forces those acoustic vibrations to fold in on themselves, generating a highly specific topological structure, a dodecahedral standing wave.
A 12-sided acoustic geometry vibrating continuously inside a granite box. I mean, that is an incredible piece of ancient engineering, assuming it's true. But what is the purpose of generating a dodecahedral wave in the middle of a pyramid?
Dukas claims that the human neurological system does not generate consciousness from the bottom up. Instead, the brain operates with a metadodecahedral field. The architecture of our cognitive field is naturally tuned to a 12-sided geometry.
Oh, wow.
So the king's chamber was engineered to generate a harmonic envelope that geometrically couples with the human consciousness manifold. The pyramid is quite literally a consciousness resonator, built out of the exact spatial operators that generated the universe, designed to synchronize the human mind with the broader operator lattice.
It's a tuning fork for the soul, built on a continental scale. That addresses the macro implementation. But the micro implementations, where the biological implications get terrifyingly specific. If the pyramid is the tuning fork, how is our biological matter capable of receiving the frequency? We are made of wet chemistry, not granite.
This is where Dukas introduces his theory of binary transduction. He maps the operator lattice directly onto the molecular structure of human DNA. We know that the DNA double helix is constructed from 4 nucleotide bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, A, T, G, and C.
The 4 letters of biological life.
Dukas maps these 4 nucleotides perfectly onto the quaternary alphabet. He argues that biology is nothing more than the physical rendering of that original cognitive partition. The nucleotides literally function as the structural states of 1 not and a 1 and 0 down 0 0.
Wait. So he is claiming that biological life didn't just evolve to use binary logic, but that the chemical letters of DNA are the spatial operators.
He argues that the DNA helix is a massive biological transducer. It acts as an antenna. Its primary function is to receive the transcendental harmonic signal of pi squared, the ambient frequency of the spherical domain that permeates all reality. When that pi squared signal hits the DNA helix, the nucleotide base pairs operate as biological logic gates.
Okay, and what do they do with the signal?
They process the transcendental frequency and chemically step it down.
So human DNA is essentially a cosmic modem.
Basically, they convert the pi squared spherical signal into the phi operator signal.
Phi, the velocity orientation operator.
Yes. And within this biological context, Dukas redefines the phi operator as the soul orientation. It is the distinct biological signature of transcendental awareness. The DNA receives the cosmic geometry of pi squared, filters it through the ATGC quaternary logic gates, and outputs a localized phi field. That phi signal is then transmitted directly to the human brain, which, as we established, is functioning as a metadodecahedral receiver perfectly tuned to catch it.
The sheer mechanics of this sequence are just staggering. DNA is a cosmic logic gate. It downloads the pi-squared spherical architecture of the universe, processes it using the 4 primordial orientation states as a biological alphabet, and outputs a phi soul field that our 12-sided brain geometry translates into the experience of being a conscious human being.
It is the ultimate synthesis. It connects the absolute highest tier of transcendental theology directly to the nucleotide bonds in our cells. It argues for a completely unbroken chain of geometric operations, from the uncomputable void of oblivion through the pi sequence and the spherical lifts, all the way down to the wet biology that allows us to perceive reality.
This entire deep dive has been a masterclass in reframing reality. I mean, if we step back and look at the whole board, Dukas has painstakingly built a universe where math is not a language we use to count apples. Math is the physical action of a distinguishing mind drawing boundaries in a void. We tracked those boundaries as they formed linear perimeters and exponential waves. We saw the tension between them lock into the rigid geometry of the circle and inflate into the sphere, leaving pi and pi squared in their wake.
And we examine how that geometry forces perfect structural symmetry onto the base 10 addressing grid, and how the eternum nexus perfectly binds the entire system together so the creation identity can begin churning out physical time and space.
We followed the symmetry breaks through the mathematical remainders to map out the physical heavens and the transcendental bridge of the Christ operator. And finally, we watched all of that abstract algebra condense into the granite standing waves of the Great Pyramid and the nucleotide transducers of our own DNA. It is a unified theory of everything that demands we view ourselves, not as biological accidents, but as perfectly tuned nodes in an endless lattice of geometric thought.
It completely dissolves the boundary between the abstract and the physical. Reality isn't built using math. Reality is what math feels like from the inside.
Which leaves me with one final, deeply unsettling implication to mull over. The entire mechanism of this universe, from the origin of the cosmos to the biology of your own cells, was kickstarted by the distinguishing mind making a cognitive choice. The act of drawing a line in the continuum. The act of establishing a boundary. If our brains are dodecahedral receivers fundamentally wired by the exact same mathematics, what does that mean for our own cognition?
That is a very profound question.
Right. Every single day you make choices. You categorize reality. You draw lines between good and bad, past and future, self and other. Every time you have a thought that makes a structural distinction, are you just processing data? Or, by the rigid laws of the operator lattice, are you actively executing a micro-creation event? When you make a choice, are you momentarily becoming the distinguishing mind running the eternum nexus and recreating the architecture of the universe in your own mind? Something to think about until our next deep dive.